Hello and welcome back. In this session, we are going to talk about your placement groups. Now, placement groups at a high level can be used when you want to control the placement of your EC2 instances. Now, just a quick recap of what we did in the last session. So, in the last session, we have looked at your key pairs. Now, what are key pairs? Key pairs are simply your login information. Now, at any point, if you want to log into your instances and if you want to authenticate to your EC2 instances, we make use of your key pairs for that. Now, in this session, we will look at an understanding. We'll try to understand what your placement groups are, the different types of placement groups we have, and why we need these placement groups. Now, once again, before we start off with the session, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Now, whenever we launch our EC2 instances, by default, what happens is this EC2 service will try to place these instances in such a way that all of our instances are spread across the underlying hardware to minimize any correlated failure. So by default, whenever let's say I'm launching 5 EC2 instances, now this service, what it will do is it will try to spread my EC2 instances across this underlying hardware. So maybe one of the instance will be running on this hardware, the other instance will run on this hardware, the other instance will run on this hardware. By default, your EC2 service will take care of it. Now, why does your EC2 service do this? This is mainly to avoid or minimize your correlated hardware failure. So assume that all of my instances are running on this hardware, and if something goes wrong with this hardware, then all of my instances are impacted. All right. Likewise, if my instance is running on this hardware or on this hardware, and if there's an issue on that particular hardware, then all the instances are affected. Now, to minimize that or to avoid that, your EC2 service will by default and will always spread your instances across this hardware so that we don't have these correlated failures. By default, that's what happens. Now, if you want to control the placement of these instances as to you want the instance to be running on this hardware or on this hardware or on this hardware or in one single hardware, we can make use of your placement groups for that. So placement groups are mainly used to influence the placement of a group of interdependent instances. All right. So whenever you want to place a group of interdependent instances to meet your workload requirement, we can make use of your placement group. So as the name suggests, it is mainly used to place your instances in a group that you want. All right. So depending on the type of workload that you have, you can create a placement group using one of the following placement strategies. So we have three options under this. So you have the cluster placement group, we have the partition placement group, and then we have the spread placement group. Now what happens in our cluster placement group is that all of your instances will be close together inside one single availability zone. So it's a cluster. So all of your instances will be in one single place. Now this strategy enables workloads to achieve the low latency network performance necessary for tightly coupled node to node communication that is typical of high performance computing applications. So if you want to reduce the network latency and if you want these instances to be tightly coupled with each other, then you can go with the cluster placement group. The next option we have is a partition placement group. Now your partition placement group will spread your instances across logical partitions such that group of instances in one partition do not share the underlying hardware with group of instances in different partitions. So under this, what happens is there will be multiple partitions that will be created, like partition 1, partition 2, partition 3, and then so on. And all of these partitions are isolated from each other. Now under this, you can choose in which partition you want your instances to be running. So if you want your instances to run in partition 1, partition 2, partition 3, and then so on. Now when we do that, the underlying hardware will not be shared with other partitions and your instances are isolated. Now this strategy is typically used by large distributed and replicated workloads such as your Hadoop applications, Cassandra applications, and your Kafka applications. And then you have your spread partition group. Now this will strictly place a small group of instances across distinct underlying hardware to reduce the correlated failure. So here the main point is to reduce your correlated hardware failure, so your instances will always be spread. So here, whenever you're launching your instances, you have the option of selecting the placement group. So if you go to this advanced details, we should be able to see your placement groups. So here you can see this placement groups and you can choose the placement groups. Now by default, we don't have any placement group. So either you can create the placement group from here, or you also have the option of creating the placement groups over here. So you can go ahead and create a new placement group, give it a name, and you can choose the strategy. So if it is cluster, then all of your instances will be tightly coupled. If it is your spread, then what options you want to select, and then finally have the partition, and you can specify how many partitions you want, 1 2 3 4 5. So let's say 4 partitions, and then click on create group. Now, once you're done creating this partition group, now whenever you're launching your EC2 instances, you have the option of selecting this partition group, the placement group. So here, now I should be able to see the partition group, and then I can select. So that's my placement group, and then in which partition you want to launch this instance. Now, I have 4 partitions over here. So these are basically 4 isolated hardware. So when I'm launching my instance in partition 2, it will not be sharing the hardware with other partitions. So this is where I can control the placement of my EC2 instances by making use of these placement groups. Now let's talk a bit more on these different types we have. So let's first talk about your cluster placement group. So like I said, your cluster placement group, it's a logical grouping of instances within a single availability zone. So under this, your instances are tightly coupled. All right. So instances in the same cluster placement group enjoy a higher per flow throughput limit for TCP IP traffic and are placed in same bisection bandwidth segment of the network. So basically here your instances are tightly coupled. You'll have low latency network performance. So you'll have a better network performance, and the node to node communication is also much better. So the cluster placement groups are recommended for applications that benefit from low network latency, high network throughput, or both. All right. So when you're creating this placement group, if you want, you can go ahead with the cluster. When you want better network performance and better throughput, you can go with the cluster placement group. The next we have is a partition placement group. So partition placement groups mainly help you to reduce the likelihood of correlated hardware failures of your application. So when you want to have different hardware, isolated hardwares, and you want to avoid the failure of these hardwares, you can go with your partition placement group. So when using partition placement groups, Amazon EC2 divides each groups into logical segments called partition. So basically your hardware will be divided into logical sections called partitions, and then when you're launching the instances, you can choose in which partition you want to launch your instances. So Amazon EC2 ensures that each partition within a placement group has its own set of racks, meaning it will have its own power source, own network. Everything will have its own set of racks. So each rack has its own network as well as your power source. Now, no two partitions within a placement group will share the same rack. So this will have its own rack, this will have its own rack, and then so on. And they will never share with each other. So this allows you to isolate the impact of your hardware failures within your application. So partition placement groups can be used to deploy large distributed and replicated workloads such as your HDFS, HBase, and Cassandra across your distinct racks. Now, a partition placement group can have partitions in multiple availability zone in the same region, and a partition placement group can have a maximum of 7 partitions per availability zone. So that's maximum you can create is 7 partitions. And the last option we have is your spread placement group. So now your spread placement group is a group of instances that are each placed on distinct hardware. So again here your instances will be spread. All right. So this is basically on each rack. So again here you'll be maintaining your EC2 service will be maintaining different racks. So spread placement groups are recommended for applications that have small number of critical instances that should be kept separate from each other. So like, you have very sensitive instances, very critical instances, and they should be kept separate from each other. Then you can go with the spread placement group. So launching instances in a spread placement group reduces the risk of simultaneous failures that might occur when instances share the same equipment, so same hardware. So again, here the point is to reduce the likelihood of your hardware failure so that your instances are not affected. So that's about your placement groups. So once again, placement groups can be used when you want to control the placement of your EC2 instances to avoid any correlated hardware failures. We can leverage your placement groups for that, and you don't have to pay any money for this. It's cost free. You don't have It's completely free. And when you're launching the instances, you can choose in which placement group you want to launch your instances. That's all I have for this session. Thank you. Once again, before you leave, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And if you like the video, leave a like and please share the video.